Morning, everybody. I'm about to get started here. Let me just repost it on my own page. And let me go ahead and get Instagram going. Unfortunately, there's no other way to do this other than to do a bit of awkward fumbling here. All right. I am now live on Instagram and live on Facebook. Good morning, everybody. Send me a few comments. C3 people, send me a few comments. Let me know you're here. And we'll get going. Yes. Patty says, Happy Easter. Thank you. Happy Easter to you. Happy Pesach. Happy Passover. Happy April is the cruelest month, says T.S. Eliot, and that's the way it feels at present. I've got a teaching today prepared, and I've been doing a series called What Really Matters. And if you tuned in last week, you know I basically was saying something like, holding that question is what matters. What matters more than, I suppose, the answering of that question, what really matters. There's something about this thing we're all in that, I don't know, seems to force the issue, force the question. What really matters? So the subtitle today is Be Between. That's what I'd like to talk about today. What really matters, be between. And let me do a few housekeeping details before we get going, particularly for the C3 community, the online C3 community. If you want to be a part of C3, West Michigan's inclusive spiritual community, like us on Facebook, find us on the web, c3westmichigan.org. We have an Instagram page as well. But a couple housekeeping details for C3ers. Read the newsletter. I'm going to say it every week as long as we're doing this. Please read the newsletter. It's one of the best ways to stay in touch, for you to stay up to date with what's happening and things that we're offering. We're offering not only Sunday morning teaching, we're offering our meditation during the week, which is done by a community member. We're offering occasionally some kids-oriented teaching, and we've been blessed, I suppose is the right word, to have some of our previous guest teachers do a little chime in, like, hey, C3, how's it going? Here's some things I've been thinking about. I wish you well. And we'll be rolling those out in the next coming weeks. Also, look for another guest teacher at this time, during this spot, at 10 a.m., because I think we'd like to transition to have some of our amazing guests. And if you're new to C3, I do half the teachings a year in Grand Haven, and the other half are all kinds of interesting and unique guests, local, sometimes not local, religious, spiritual, scientific, academic, just really interesting people, social justice oriented people. So all kinds of interesting guests. So stay in the loop by reading the newsletter. Sign up for the newsletter. You can find that on our website. And of course, we're a nonprofit. We're a spiritual organization. So your ongoing support is needed, and we're really grateful for it. So thank you. Also, big announcement, and this is huge. Last year, C3 partnered with Grand Haven to begin to partnered with Spring Lake to begin to replant the downtown area and other areas of Spring Lake because of the ash borer disease, replant trees. And it was a wildly successful program. We donated a lot of money, individuals, which was supported by a matching donation and supported by the city of Spring Lake itself. And there are now dozens of trees because of this effort. And it was so successful, we want to roll it out again for Earth Day, which is coming up. except this time we're going to partner with the city of Grand Haven, and this is your opportunity to plant a tree. $85. Then you'll be met by a matching donation plus the cooperation of the city of Grand Haven. Why should we do this now? Because it matters, and it helps us think beyond even the anxiety and stress of the present moment and how long is this going to last. A tree says something like, let's have a long-term vision. So the program is called Plant Up and Fly Right. It's meant to counterset carbon emissions with our air travel, which all of us do. I'm majorly guilty of that. I travel all over the world, so I planted a tree last year. I probably ought to plant another one. But this is an amazing opportunity, I think, for us to just think in a larger way about our city, about West Michigan, about the planet, about the globe. I mean, often many of us are feeling a bit paralyzed, and this is something you can do that's concrete and will hopefully outlast you, outlast me, and be some kind of gift. Hold on, let me just shut my door here. Oh, just got to get my daughter's iPod for her. Okay, I'm back. So Plant Up and Fly Right, the information is on our website. Click under the recent newsletter there, or read our newsletter. All the information is in there. Or call us, Google us, call us, leave us a message. We'll get you whatever information you might need to make this possible. So that's very exciting. Okay, so back to my teaching here. What really matters? Again, the subtitle is Be Between. And I want to start off with a Wendell Berry poem here. This is called a bit of the poem called The Real Work. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we have come to our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings. The real work. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we have come to our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings, meaning those little natural blockages in the perpetual flowing of the stream is where all the vitality is, the liveliness, the song of the stream itself. There's something about this poem that I feel like I need right now. And a reminder, a kind of hopeful reminder that the global situation that we're all in is a kind of impediment, a kind of blockage. And in the middle of it, it feels like that's all it is, which is just a blockage. But Wendell Berry here is sort of beautifully singing that it's the blockage itself that creates the song. And I don't know, in a way, I'm carrying that as a kind of hopeful prayer, a kind of hopeful promise, a kind of reminder based on experience and elderhood. Wendell Berry, to me, is one of my elders. And we need the voices of wisdom right now, the voices that have some experience, the voices that can think beyond the CNN ticker at the bottom of the screen with its urgent updates all the time. And we need poetry. I don't know if you're like me, but I've been listening to music and reading. I mean, I'm not acting like super enlightened here, but It's actually coming from a kind of hunger. I'm really grateful to the musicians, like the musicians that we have at C3, which will be followed by here, of course, and but also like the musicians around the world that are saying, "Here's the song. Here's the song that I'm singing as the stream of my life is impeded by this global pandemic." So that's the opening poem, and I'll maybe read it again. And I thought it might be worth just saying a bit of how I'm feeling in case you're feeling in a similar spot. I think there was initially some, from my point of view, some adrenaline and a sense of how we might as a family and as a community face what's going on. But that kind of feels like the adrenaline has waned here. And I'm feeling actually a lot of sadness and saying things like Happy Easter. It doesn't really feel that way to me. In a way, it feels almost premature. And I guess I'm feeling a bit of the suffering, and I feel very privileged. I'm working from home. I have a paycheck. And so many people don't. So many people don't even have the luxury of working from home. A friend of mine from high school, he's an ER doctor at Spectrum. And, there's there's the mystique of the doctor. And we all knew he was going to be a doctor when we were in high school because he was really smart and he would like party and goof off and make jokes and get straight A's. We're like, okay, he's got some chops here. And sure enough, becomes an ER doctor. And I saw him post a picture the other day he had his mask on and he had a shirt that said the night shift. And there was something, I even feel a bit of emotion about it just now as I'm speaking, just like, okay, this is not just a prestigious job. This is an act of deep service and solidarity to the world. I was really inspired by the courage. Would I want to do that? I have to be honest, that would be difficult. I'm just thinking of the nurses and policemen. My good friend and previous neighbor is a canine. He's in the canine unit at Grand Rapids Police Department, and he can't work from home. He has to go to work and interact with people and with dangerous situations and with people who are sick. And I don't know. I feel the grief of that, and also the gratitude that many people are stepping forward in a courageous way and risking their lives. So I guess I'm feeling a sense of loss and sadness, and also just not knowing when this will be over. And we all feel that. It's like I'm just waiting for someone to speculate, the correct numbers, and it just feels like that just stretches out further and further. And I guess the other thing I'm feeling right now is just how fragile modern life is. Like what we thought of as normal, which is phrases that people keep using, when we were going to go back to normal, just the way things are, that's what's being disrupted. And there's a kind of grief with that. And it's humbling. That's what I'd say. It's humbling. So the other thing I thought I might mention, I'll talk a bit about Easter and Passover just historically in a couple minutes, but I'm thinking about some what I've been teaching and writing about and making podcasts about over the last few years. And maybe one way of summarizing is just a conversation about spiritual change and about spiritual growth and about the patterns of growth and change. And I keep repeating them all the time. And patterns like that change happens in liminal spaces, something I've said many times, I've written about, and liminal space is that in-between space that it just means threshold in Latin, as you probably know. But and every single ancient religious site around the world had thresholds, these in-between spaces between ordinary space and sacred space, would be one way of putting it. but also just in terms of stories and myths and in our own psycho-spiritual growth and development, it's the wisdom tradition says that change happens in between. So we've left one room and haven't arrived in the other. And I've said that many times, and I felt that in my own life. Or another way of putting it is that is to think about the pattern of severance and descent and underworld and return. That's that classic descent and return pattern. That's the book of Jonah, down into the whale's belly. That's Joseph Campbell's hero's journey or heroine's journey, the severance and descent and underworld and return, the classic pattern of change. And it's one thing to talk about it. It's one thing to tell stories about it. It's another thing to be in it, not personally, but collectively. Nobody's choice. Nobody got up in the morning and said, hey, I'd really like to experience a global severance from the way things are, from business as usual, except that's what happened. And following severance is the phase of descent. And that's where we are. And I just want to say, it's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to be in it. And it doesn't feel good. Nobody says like, hey, I'm so glad I'm in the classic pattern of change. And also, if you know anything about myths and stories and legends and spiritual growth that models this kind of descent and return or liminality, there's no guarantee. There's no like, hey, for sure we'll all grow up. For sure we'll make better decisions in the future. There are not guarantees in the kind of liminal space. And so I'm just acknowledging it doesn't feel great to be in it. It hurts in between. It's not something that you can just simply pull the ripcord or the eject button in your life. Nobody can. It's a kind of global reality that we're living in. Maybe one of the few things that we can say that I think we're collectively being invited into, which is what I said in some of my previous talks, which is time for a searching inventory, time for a searching moral inventory, time for a searching spiritual inventory. And I'm preaching to myself. How have I been living? What are my values? What have I taken for granted? Who have I ignored? What about the inner journey and the external journey? My inner world and the world around me, those concentric circles that swing out. What have I taken for granted and ignored? I think these are the big questions of self-examination. And maybe the other thing we're invited into is tiny acts of kindness in the in-between phase, not knowing. I was thinking about that with our simple Plant Up and Fly Right program, Plant a Tree. For Earth Day. It's so small and it's also not so small. And I think more and more of us are beginning to see those tiny invitations and maybe the courage to say yes. What's my main point? The classic pattern of descent and return, the classic liminality doesn't feel all that great. It's not like, hey, great, we're really going through some changes here. And that's where we are. And what I'm suggesting is be here. Like what I'm saying, be between things. That's where we're called to be. One of my teachers and mentors, Bill Plotkin, who I brought up before, in his book, Nature and the Human Soul, he has this map in 8 stages. And I'm not going to give it to you now. It's a super long book, so I couldn't summarize it anyway. But at the end of each stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, he says this little line right at the end. He says, and stage 3, for example, is the best stage to be. And then you read the next chapter, stage 4, and stage 4 is the best stage to be. And it's just kind of a subtle reminder that where we are is where we are, and it's the best place to be, even though it's painful. So that's part of what I'm saying about be. The other thing I think I'd like to say is just a bit about Passover and Easter. They don't often, by the way, coincide, Passover and Easter. The Jewish calendar is different than the Roman calendar. But they happen to line up. And in a symbolic sense, I think there's something interesting about this. And of course, Passover is about 1,000 years older than the story of Jesus. So For 1,000 years, think about that, for 1,000 years, the Jewish people, or the Hebrew people as they were called, and eventually the Jewish people, were celebrating this story of liberation, which is at the heart of the Exodus story. Being slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and leaving Egypt and entering that liminal space of the desert before they entered the promised land. In other words, the classic pattern of change. For 1,000 years, I mean, just think how old is the United States? And we think, of our permanence and our importance. And for 1,000 years already, the Jewish people had been celebrating Pesach, Passover, this liberating story of a minority group in a power-hungry culture, Egypt and Mesopotamia for that matter, the underdog being liberated out of slavery. And Jesus happens to come into that narrative as a Jewish person and is killed, of course, by the Romans during Passover, during the ceremony of liberation, during the place where people were remembering and longing for a sense of freedom, a sense of the chains coming off and bondage, the time of year when people were singing songs about liberation. That's when Jesus enters the story, and he has a kind of counter, in a way, liberation story, which is he doesn't come in triumphantly. He comes in weeping into the city and is killed only a week later during the festival that celebrates freedom. I mean, the kind of spiritual irony is tremendous in this narrative. And of course, there was no Christianity at the time. It was just a group of followers of Jesus. And actually, most of the men abandoned ship. And it's really only the women who, at the end, have the courage to face what's happening and also face what's happening after Jesus' death, meaning they're the ones that go and prepare the body and visit the tomb. They're the ones that hear the story in first, which is interesting in and of itself, especially in a more patriarchal culture. So you have this story of death and resurrection, again, the classic descent, underworld, return. And what strikes me right now in the 21st century, in 2020, during COVID-19, I think I cannot help but see the symbolic and metaphoric overtones of being unable to meet on Easter morning for the churches in America and for this inclusive spiritual community, unable to meet. And in a way, celebrating something like resurrection is not fitting right now. If you just think symbolically about where we are, we have experienced a kind of severance, a kind of descent, and we're in between. We're in the underworld, we're in the abyss, we're in Hades, we're in hell, we're in the labyrinth, to use the Greek underworld imagery. That's where we are. We're not in the return, we're not in the resurrection, April is the cruelest month, where spring is just barely creeping out. And if you're in West Michigan, you're probably already feeling depressed about the weather. I looked at that 5-day forecast. I'm like, oh God, seriously. All right, this is Michigan. And by the way, I'm not against churches celebrating Easter. In fact, I think quite the opposite. We need a sense of history. This is one of my points. We need something other than the ticker at the bottom of the screen. We need to remember we've been here before as human beings, that are born out of a sense of story and place and tradition. And even if you're not particularly religious and maybe you're more scientifically minded or humanist oriented, we've been here before. Wars and germs and inquisitions and crusades and pandemics and epidemics, and we've been here before. And it doesn't feel good, but it's something like a greater sense of history is needed. So thinking about Passover, thinking about Easter, I think is healthy and important. However, It seems obvious to me the symbolic place we're in is in between. It's 3 days in the tomb. It's 3 days in the belly of the whale. That's where we are. And the invitation is to be in that place, not to run ahead to the future and not to run ahead back into the past. To say, I long for how it once was. It will never be the same. That's my intuition. I hope I'm wrong. I hope the idea we go back to normal. I actually hope that's not the case. I hope we go back to health, well-being, and a greater sense of safety for sure. But part of me also longs for the ways in which our culture might mature, and I might mature, and we might mature. And you mature in the liminal spaces, the in between, be between things, between Good Friday and resurrection from a Christian point of view, or between Exodus from Egypt and the promised land. That's the desert. That's where all the goodness happens, the painful goodness. It's like there's that line in the Psalms. Let me try to remember it. You gave us honey from the rock. What a metaphor. You gave us honey from the rock. We tasted something good in the harshness of the desert landscape. That's an old story I think that's needed right now. And we need stories, a sense of history. In fact, it's hard to know where we're going, what sense of where we've been. And I think that's part of us why we crave the old stories, or any story, you could say. Actually, I mean, people are like addicted to Netflix. It tells you right there. People are addicted to stories. So what kind of story are we telling? And the old stories, like the Hebrew stories, from dust you came, to dust you shall return. Yeah, a meditation on that. More of that, yes. And let me go back to something in the Wendell Berry poem. He says, the mind that is not baffled is not employed. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings, and my mind is baffled. And in fact, I feel most of the time like silence is needed more than words. Like I haven't been very motivated to say a whole lot, or to make too many podcasts, or to post. And right now it's like crazy on social media. You have like the preachers and the shamers and the blamers, and those who are saying, hey, I'm just having a great time, just really loving this time. And, it's like you sense the desperation beneath that. And of course, I feel the desperation too. And there's something about the silence that I think I'm feeling invited into, both inward and outward. Not being too quick with the tongue right now is sort of how I'm feeling. And to allow the sense of being baffled to activate engagement. Because I think the temptation right now for me, and probably for many of you, is that, yeah, we feel baffled, and the temptation is to numb out. I saw that alcohol sales are skyrocketing, Netflix, membership and whatever. And again, I'm not mocking any of this. I watch Netflix. I watched it last night, but I'm just saying, baffling and numbing is one response. But I'm saying something like, hearing in the Wendell Berry poem, yes, be baffled, but be engaged. And I want to be engaged. I want to turn to the liminality of the present moment, to be between things right now, without too many words, to let it work on me. Especially in a culture where there's so many ways of numbing out. And maybe one final point here, and I sort of already made it, but maybe it's worth repeating here. I'm not so sure if life should go back to normal. And what would that look like? And I think allowing ourselves to be baffled by that possibility may just bring forth the singing of the stream. In other words, the creative muse-like whisperings of the human soul and of nature itself to bring forth a more healthy, life-giving and whole way of being in the world and global way of being in the world. We can no longer live under the illusion of isolation and separateness and specialness and borders. It's just not possible anymore, and it requires that kind of massive imagination to break that open. Maybe we don't need to go back to a culture built on consumption and pollution and food inequality and healthcare injustice. I don't think we need to go back to that world. But we also need to be between and to let even the suffering and the impeded stream to do its work, and to trust that the creative wellspring of the soul and of the human spirit and of the collective human spirit of communities and families and countries possibly having a larger imagination for a good and generous world. That's the. So let me end, I think, with reading again from Wendell Berry. The real work. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we have come to our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings. May you find your own song, or allow your own song to emerge in this collective impediment that we find ourselves in. So that's my talk. Thanks for listening today. Thanks so many of you for chiming in, being a part of this, and lending your voice. Even I'm just glancing at these comments. Thank you for sharing what it's like to be you. This is not nothing. Engaging even in a social media sense. Thank you to the Instagram people for joining me. I appreciate it. Thank you, Facebook friends, friends and acquaintances. And yeah, I wish you well. I mean, stay safe and stay smart and be courageous, be of heart during this in-between phase. Happy Easter, happy Pesach, happy spring. May you find your song. Stay for on the C3 page.